आदाब। मैं आयशा नजीब अंजुमन तरक्की उर्दू हिंद के जानिब से आपका इस्तकबाल करती हूँ। हम शुक्रगुज़ार हैं इंडिया इंटरनेशनल सेंटर के, जो इस प्रोग्राम का शरीक मेज़बान इदारा है। प्रोग्राम की इब्तिदा से पहले मैं अपने मुअज़्ज़ज़ मेहमानों से दरख्वास्त करती हूँ कि वो स्टेज पर तशरीफ़ ले आएँ। मैं दरख्वास्त करती हूँ जनाब NN वोहरा साहब से, जो आज के जलसे की सदारत कर रहे हैं, कि वो स्टेज पर आएँ। जनाब NN वोहरा साहब। अब मैं बाकी मेहमानान गिरामी जनाब श्याम सरन साहब, सदर इंडिया इंटरनेशनल सेंटर, अंजुमन के सदर जनाब सदीक़ुर रहमान क़िदवई साहब, मोहतरम जनाब सलमान खुर्शीद साहब, अंजुमन की बरतानवी शाख के सरबराह डॉक्टर सैफ महमूद साहब, हम सब की मोहतरम और हम में से बहुत से लोगों की उस्ताद और आज के कलीदी खुतबे की मुकर्रिर प्रोफेसर नारायणी गुप्ता साहिबा। जलसे की इब्तिदा में मुनासिब ये है कि आपके सामने अंजुमन तरक्की उर्दू हिंद का मुख्तसर तारुफ पेश किया जाए। अंजुमन तरक्की उर्दू हिंद उर्दू का सबसे क़दीम इदारा है, जिसका क़याम सर सैयद अहमद ख़ान ने 1882 में किया था और जिसे कौम परस्त इदारा बनाने के लिए सबसे ज़्यादा कोशिशें हिंदुस्तान के पहले वज़ीर तालीम और अंजुमन के पहले असिस्टेंट सेक्रेटरी इमामुल हिंद मौलाना अबुल कलाम आज़ाद और सदर जमहूरिया हिंद के ओहदे तक पहुँचने वाली उस शख्सियत ने की जो तवील अरसे तक अंजुमन के भी सदर रहे। मेरी मुराद डॉक्टर ज़ाकिर हुसैन साहब से है। आज़ादी के बाद अंजुमन ही वो इदारा था जिसने न सिर्फ सूबाई हुकूमतों से बल्कि मरकज़ी हुकूमतों से भी उर्दू के फ़रोग़ और इर्तिक़ा के लिए हर मुमकिन इक़दाम कराए और आज मुख्तलिफ़ यूनिवर्सिटियों में शोबा उर्दू, सूबाई उर्दू अकादमियाँ और मुख्तलिफ़ सूबों में उर्दू को जो दूसरी सरकारी ज़बान का दर्जा मिला हुआ है, उसके पीछे सिर्फ़ अंजुमन की ही कोशिशें कार फरमा रही हैं। दुनिया की सिर्फ़ 2 ज़बानें ही ऐसी हैं जिनमें ज़बान की मेयारबंदी के इदारे हैं। ये 2 ज़बानें उर्दू और फ़्रांसीसी हैं। दोनों ही ज़बानों में मेयार के पैमाने बहुत सख्त हैं। फ़्रांसीसी में एकेडमी फ्रैंकाइज़ और उर्दू में अंजुमन तरक्की उर्दू हिंद ही ऐसे इदारे हैं जो ज़बान और अहले क़लम को इस्तनाद फ़राहम करते हैं। अंजुमन के इस मुख्तसर तारुफ़ के बाद अब बहुत मुख्तसर तौर पर इस 4 रोज़ा इल्मी तक़रीब के बारे में अर्ज़ कर दूँ। ये 4 रोज़ा तक़रीब 13 इजलास और 5 बेहतरीन सक़ाफ़ती महफ़िलों से सजी हुई है। इस तक़रीब में दिल्ली की 500 साला तारीख़ के मुख्तलिफ़ गोशों को समझने की सई की गई है। मीर से मंसूब इस महफ़िल में लफ्ज़ों के गुलदस्ते से बेहतर कोई तोहफ़ा मेहमानों के इस्तक़बाल के लिए नहीं हो सकता। इसलिए मैं निहायत एहतराम के साथ अंजुमन तरक्की उर्दू हिंद की बरतानवी शाख के सरबराह डॉक्टर सैयद सैफ महमूद साहब से गुजारिश कर रही हूँ कि वो तशरीफ़ लाएँ और मेहमानान का इस्तक़बाल करें। गुफ्तगू में महारत ज़बान कैसा जादू पैदा करती है, इसका अंदाज़ा आपको सैयद सैफ महमूद साहब के इस्तक़बालिया कलिमात से हो जाएगा। शुक्रिया।
बहुत बहुत शुक्रिया आपका आयशा। इस तारुफ़ का उर्दू शायरी में मुबालग़े का एक बहुत अहम मकाम रहा है, एग्ज़ैजरेशन। इट हैज़ हैड अ डिस्टिंक्टिव प्लेस इन उर्दू लिटरेचर। By this very generous introduction of yours, you have at least proved that you are following the tradition of Urdu literature, keeping it alive. लेकिन मुश्ताक़ यूसुफ़ी साहब ने फरमाया था कि इस तरह का जो जेनरस इंट्रोडक्शन होता है, इस तरह का जो तारुफ़ होता है, वो उमूमन ताज़ियाती जलसों के लिए मख़सूस रहता है। So I just hope that's not going to be the case here. ख़वातीन व हज़रात, मुझे हुक्म हुआ कि सिर्फ मैं आप लोगों का खैर मक़दम ही ना करूं, बल्कि आप लोगों का खैर मक़दम अंग्रेज़ी में करूं। और अव्वल इसलिए कि अव्वल तो यहाँ हमारे कुछ ऐसे मेहमान हैं जो उर्दू नहीं समझ, जिनकी ज़बान उर्दू नहीं है, और दूसरा ये कि आने वाले 4 दिनों में बहुत सारी उर्दू, बहुत अच्छी उर्दू बोली जाएगी और मुझसे कहीं बेहतर उर्दू बोलने वाले आपसे मुखातिब होंगे। तो मैं कोशिश करता हूँ और मैं आपको यकीन दिलाता हूँ कि मैं कोई तकरीर नहीं करूँगा. Lawyers don't speak for long. Salman Saab will bear me out unless we have paid our fee. I haven't even raised a bill. My book, Beloved Delhi, it starts with a sher of Maulana Hali. Tazkira Dehliye marhoom ka ए दोस्त न छेड़. तज़किरा दहलिए मरहूम का ए दोस्त न छेड़, न सुना जाएगा हमसे ये फसाना हरगिज़. And I have translated it in my book. So don't talk to me of the late lamented Delhi, my friend. I don't have the heart to hear this story. Delhi gives me the permission to be obnoxious. This was the reply I got from an expat friend when I asked her why she insisted on living in Delhi, even though her Indian husband did not. Delhi's charms are unpredictable. The chaotic streets, the unruly traffic and the polluted air, the aggressive inhabitants and their hurried life, the tolerance for the obnoxious. I think all this together, they constitute, an integral part of this phenomenal city. But inextricably intertwined with Delhi's complicated present is her past, her history, a history of invasions, of assaults, even of massacres. It has been late lamented many times through centuries, yet it lives. Each time it was razed to the ground, it came back to life with startling vivacity. Nothing dies in Delhi. Ghosts of its past lives roam the streets or bide their time in half-ruined buildings. And they rise up to speak in 1,000 stories that are still told about the city. But struggling to breathe beneath this huge modern megalopolis is another one, time-worn and easily missed, that teems with art, literature, culture, poetry, and that is the Delhi of Meer and Ghalib. The Delhi of the fabled 7 cities, of all of which have risen and fallen and risen again, and have been changed by now beyond recognition. It was Delhi's indestructible spirit that has haunted writers, poets, and artists for generations. Some of them have written out of love, some have written in awe, and some actually out of bewilderment. It was Meer who said, Dilo Dilli, dono agar hain kharab. Dilo Dilli, dono agar hain kharab, par kuch lutf is ujde ghar mein bhi hain. Ladies and gentlemen, if you want to rubbish Winston Churchill's claim that history will be kind to me for I have written it, you must try and look for the relics and remnants of the life of Mir Taqi Mir, the fiery romancer of Delhi, that fiercely self-respecting poet, the passionate lover and quintessential Dilliwala, whom Urdu literature today knows as Khuda-e-Sukhan, or God of Poetry. It was Mir who, in the words of Jamil Jalebi, and I quote him, brought the Urdu language out of the royal court and made it stand on the staircases of Delhi's Jama Masjid. It was the same Mir for whom Mirza Ghalib would later say, "Rekhte ke tum hi ustad nahi ho Ghalib, कहते हैं अगले ज़माने में कोई मीर भी था." And it was the same Mir who, the poet laureate of the last Mughal court, Ustad Zauq, would envy. Na hua, par na hua, Mir ka andaz naseeb. Na hua, par na hua, Mir ka andaz naseeb. Zauq, yaron ne bahut zor ghazal mein mara. This was Mir, and he wrote history. But history treated him rather shabbily. Even the Urdu world, I am at pains to say, has hardly taken note of the fact that this is the 3rd centenary of Mir Taqi Mir. Anjuman Taraqi Urdu Hind, as you all know, is the oldest body in the world, constituted with the objective of promoting and preserving the Urdu language. With a rich legacy of about 150 years, Anjuman itself is an integral part of the history of Delhi and the history of Urdu language. Anjuman, in collaboration with the India International Center, is delighted and honored to celebrate 300 years of Mir Taqi Mir. In these 4 days, we'll talk not just about the languages of Delhi, but also about the literature, the history, the architecture, the waterways, and the food and composite culture and society and music of this great city. Added to these, we will showcase for you some of the best artists and performances. You will notice that throughout the festival, the title of each session is actually a misra from one or the other couplet of Mir Taqi Mir. पैदा कहाँ हैं ऐसे परागंदा तबा लोग, अफसोस तुमको मीर से सोहबत नहीं रही. मीर से सोहबत तो नहीं, लेकिन 4 दिनों में हम आपको मीर के शहर से आपका तारुफ तो करा ही सकते हैं. On behalf of Anjuman, I heartily welcome all of you. Let me welcome the eminent guests on the dais, especially the chair for the session, Mr. N.N. Vora, our distinguished keynote speaker, Professor Narayani Gupta, President of the IIC, Mr. Shyam Saran, President of the Anjuman, Professor Sadiqur Rahman Qidwai Sahab, former Minister, Senior Advocate, Mr. Salman Khurshid, the Director of the British Council could not join us today, Alison Barrett, but you would be happy to know that last year, Anjuman has set up a vertical in the UK in the form of a not-for-profit organization based out of London. Our objective is to reach the thousands of diaspora members in the United Kingdom whose origins are rooted in Urdu culture. And allow me to say this, and I say it with all humility at my command, Urdu needs to be democratized and de-ghettoized. It is a secular language, a language whose origins are predicated on inclusivity. And Urdu walas need to constantly remind themselves and others of this truth. This is what we are trying to do through the Anjuman in the United Kingdom. I welcome you all, our distinguished speakers and artists who will be with us in the next 4 days, members of the media, our lovely audience who have made time for Shahjahanabad today. And allow me to add a personal note. None of this would have been possible without the guidance of the President of Anjuman, Professor Dr. Sadiqur Rahman Qidwai Sahab, and the General Secretary, Dr. Athar Farooqi. In fact, it should be Dr. Farooqi who should be standing here today in my place and welcoming you all. But being the typical Athar Farooqi that all of you know, he wanted only to exploit my love for Shahjahanabad. Not only that, but also to make my incompetence public. And I dare say, it's a very Meer-like trait. बल्कि मीर होते अगर तो शायद अंजुमन के सेक्रेटरी होते. Anyway, here I am, straight after an 8-hour flight from London, standing before you. Ladies and gentlemen, as the magical spell of Delhi endures, we hope that the city beguiles you in the next 4 days. मैं अनवर जलालपुरी के 4 शेर आपकी खिदमत में पेश करके इजाज़त लेता हूँ कि कुछ यकीन, कुछ गुमान की दिल्ली. कुछ यकीन, कुछ गुमान की दिल्ली, अनगिनत इम्तिहान की दिल्ली. मकबरे भी नहीं सलामत अब, थी कभी आन बान की दिल्ली. ख्वाब, किस्सा, ख्याल, अफसाना. ख्वाब, किस्सा, ख्याल, अफसाना. हाय उर्दू ज़बान की दिल्ली, बेज़बानी का हो गई है शिकार. असदुल्लाह खान की दिल्ली. बहुत बहुत शुक्रिया आपका. I also take this opportunity to welcome K.N. Srivastav Sahab, the Director of the Indian International Center. हमारी ऐन खुशकिस्मती है कि हमारे साथ प्रोफेसर नारायणी गुप्ता साहिबा तशरीफ़ रखती हैं. Professor Narayani Gupta is one of the most eminent historians of India and a leading expert on the socio-political history of the city of Delhi. Former professor at Jamia Millia Islamia. Her scholarly works on Delhi and especially her book, Delhi Between the Two Empires, is widely recognized as groundbreaking. I can only say that it is impossible to speak of Delhi and its history without speaking of and to Professor Narayani Gupta. And therefore, it was only apposite for Anjuman to request her to deliver the keynote address today. We are honored that you have accepted our request, ma'am. And let me not stand between you and the keynote speaker now, Professor Narayani Gupta.
Respected Shri Vora, I think the lady from the British Council is not here, Ms. Barrett, Salman Khurshid Saab, Ambassador Shyam Saran, Professor Qidwai, and Dr. Srivastava, Saib Mahmood Sahib, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to, if I may reverently call it, the siesta session. And you're free to indulge, because it's a bit cruel to ask you to keep your eyes open. But I'm delighted to be here. I feel it's a great honor. And I would particularly like to thank Dr. Athar Farooqi and Aisha Najib, who helped with all the preliminaries for the conference. Thank you very much for your kindness. For intellectual and moral support, I could not do without Niharika, so I have to acknowledge her, though she's not part of this foundation. And now I shall give you my kind of thoughts on the city as what has been happening to it in the past 25 years or so. Did that close? The city which we shall be celebrating is one which has been expressed in art, in music, in theater, and above all, in poetry. Meer stands for more than one person. Shahjahanabad stands for more than one city. Yesterday, we had another happy day, Vasant Panchami, which is the special day of, thank you, Nizamuddin Basti. And everybody was out in lovely golden yellow. I think maybe Shahjahanabad should also find a day for itself at some stage. The title of this conference is The Evolving City. But all cities evolve. None of them is set in stone. The Indian census defines a town or city by population, but they are not just agglomerations of people. They have evolved through crises and celebration, social and political. And each of them is different. Shahjahanabad can be compared in relative size to the historic cores of London and Paris, to take examples. The historic city of London, which is an extremely small area near St. Paul's Cathedral, and the Ile de la Cité, which is the island from which Paris began to expand. It can compare with them, but it is highly unlikely that one could sustain a seminar for 4 days to discuss either of these two areas, though they're densely populated with buildings, people, and history. Shahjahanabad is different. It was the 7th in a series of towns located in different areas, moving progressively northward. Today, Delhi covers all those sites and extends its tentacles east, south, west, and north. London perhaps still exudes the optimism of commerce from the 19th century, Paris that of civic art from the 12th century. Shahjahanabad is braided together, for most of us, with an elegant language that came to maturity after Meer in the 19th century, which a language of civilized interaction at the base and of sublime poetry at its heights. Urdu or Hindustani gives Shahjahanabad a distinct geographical and linguistic individuality. Other Indian languages are specific to regions, but Urdu to a city. How does one imprison the history of a city in words? Poetry is evocative. It can be a wondrous mix of landscape, time of year, commonplace activities, an inexplicable lifting of the spirit. It can capture spectacle and performance, but how do you trap its fragrances and flavors? How do you recall the rush of frightened feet in a stampede, or the strident voice of a speaker in the centuries before you had loudspeakers? How do you disentangle the local from the regional, recognize the international? All of this needs the support of historical context. The only viable way, ultimately, to read a city is to pick a family, a neighborhood, a street, a profession, an institution, and follow it through. Memories can be pegs for putting together history. In the 1950s, this is my childhood, it was a special day when we rode on the tram in Chandni Chowk. Another memory is that of sitting on daris, raptly watching the Ram Leela outside Dilli gate. In Delhi University, there was a subject which turned up every other year as an essay topic for a compulsory paper in English. It was write or describe a conversation between old and new Delhi. I fantasize about hundreds of those essays on paper now golden with age, piled in some basement of the university. I wonder what we wrote. Nothing sharpens one's fluency, of course, as much as blithe ignorance, so we must have written a lot. When I look back, I marvel at the complacent ignorance of the denizens of New Delhi. I often heard grown-ups asking, who are the original people of Delhi? The Jains, the Kayas, the Khatris, and the Ashraf of the Sheher, as much as the Jats and Gujars of the urbanized villages, were not differentiated as native by contrast to immigrant Bengalis, Tamilians, Gujaratis, etc. And for those older inhabitants, New Delhi must have seemed like a village inhabited by short-term residents, leading very lonely lives in houses along wide, empty roads, where nobody would understand the meaning of the word Ronak. It was exactly like this that people of the Sheher, 100 years earlier, had perceived and pitied the poor British living in loneliness in the civil lines. Purani and Nai Dilli are terms which are still used by people of a certain age. But more commonly, you see the two of them now sharing space in what is called Central Delhi, surrounded by Southwest, North, and East Delhi. Younger people know metro stops as they emerge like moles blinking in the sunlight from Chandni Chowk, Rajiv Chowk, Patel Chowk stations. And to cab drivers, it's not Delhi, it is the NCR. It's 57 years since I began to put together what an earnest schoolgirl described to her mother inaccurately but evocatively as Delhi's autobiography. In 1967, when I began my treasure hunt, I was 25. Shahjahanabad was 325 years old. In the following years, the city has evolved, but so has scholarship. The books on Delhi published from the 1970s, research, new editions, reprints, collections of essays, add up to well over 70. They're not only in Urdu, Hindi, and English, even in Bangla and Malayalam. Maybe other languages too, that's my ignorance. Add other kinds of material, performances, films, and we get the collage of a vibrant and creative city. A precious memory of mine is that of Mahmood Farooqi in an earlier life, entertaining a group of special children on the steps of the Jama Masjid. It was a riot. Many who have enriched our understandings of Delhi are participating in the seminar. Shahid Amin, Amar Farooqi, Ratish Nanda, William Dalrymple were students of history, architecture, and the classics when I first met them. They may wander off to other hunting grounds, but they get pulled back to Shahjahanabad. I'm confident that new combinations will suggest themselves after we listen to stories and the challenges faced by geography and climate in the region, descriptions and visualizations of the built city, and about two individuals who lived at what we now see as a period of transition, the gentle Bahadur Shah Zafar and Master Ramchandra, as much representative of the city's ethos as were its much-loved poets. Some individuals whose work has been inspirational should be remembered with gratitude. First, I put Percival Spear, who could never get away from Delhi. He lived in St. Stephen's at one end, but he was all over the place on his bicycle or leading little crocodiles of college boys on their bicycles. He was a generous and gentle mentor, and he left in 1981 with the happiness of having a volume of essays on Delhi dedicated to him. Those who came after include Akhtar Kambar, Sunil Kumar, Mushirul Hassan. All these are now lost to us. Yunus Jafri was so occupied in helping others that he never got to write a book himself. 50 years ago, in 1975, the term Shahjahanabad was pulled out, dusted, and presented by two extremely different individuals. The first was Maheshwar Dayal, a Kayas from one of the old families of the Shahar, who had been writing a weekly column in the Hindustan Times entitled Rediscovering Delhi. He published these as a book with the subtitle, The Story of Shahjahanabad. The other was Jagmohan, a Punjabi, a man in a hurry, like many talented and very driven people who had migrated from the other side of the border, who published Rebuilding Shahjahanabad, the Walled City of Delhi. Seeing himself as a barren houseman 100 years after that architect remodeled, rebuilt modern Paris. The leitmotif of discussions on Shahjahanabad for the following half century, since 1975, has veered between Dayal and Jagmohan. Nostalgic recovery of history, on the one hand, and suggestions of how to overlay that history with the elements of a modern city. The historians were joined by sociologists, architects, and planners. Some of them are here. They had long, pleasant, but mostly unproductive discussions. There was a 1980 seminar by the School of Planning, I remember, in Maxwell Bhavan, on how to improve living conditions in traditional living areas of Shahjahanabad. It survives in a rather tatty little pamphlet, and that's that. Looking back, I realized there is one language which competes with Urdu to be dominant in the Shahar. I will identify it a little later. Visitors to Shahjahanabad from the 17th century to the early 20th describe the city in fulsome terms, some in anthropomorphic. Many travelogues were in non-Indian languages and became available to most of us only after the obvious delays. I like to think there are many more which will turn up in various archives. We live in hope. The city's episodes of crisis brought out the best in its own poets, writing in the genre called Shair-Ashob. Most richly textured were the accounts in fiction, like Nazir Ahmed's Miratul-Urus, which depicts the superior attitude of Chandni Chowk inhabitants vis-a-vis those of the more plebeian house Qazi. The gullies and kuchas were imbued with nostalgia, while the crowded sadak was portrayed as the forum for citizens to occupy as they chose. Humor, irony, detachment are their special qualities. They should not be segregated in language study departments, but be part of the lives of people. I would like to congratulate the Anjuman for the wonderful way they have, in this seminar, woven in elements of performance at the end of the day. Coming back to the perceptions of the city. From the mid-19th century, writings on Delhi repeatedly emphasized its long history, following dynasty on dynasty. It started with Sayyid Ahmad Khan's Asar-u-Sanadid, which was very different from earlier writings. This, which will be discussed at the seminar, marks the adoption of the style of listing buildings in a more clinical fashion, the Western style. Overlapping with the historicization of the city was the sense of the rightness that the capital of British India should be the 8th Delhi. And in sharp contrast to the plans for a capital city, which we live with, laid out according to Western tradition, was the concern, this is something that did not materialize, so I'm referring to it, the concern to have a road which linked it with Shahjahanabad, and to make that, in turn, less crowded. So from Jama Masjid to Parliament Street, and they were, for a long time, one could actually see Jama Masjid from Minto Bridge. This never got built. The concern with the dilapidated old city, as they called it, remained. The municipality needed help to handle this. So we set up the Delhi Improvement Trust in 1936. This morphed into the DDA in 1955. In retrospect, we realized that this was a much more total conquest of Delhi than either 1803 or 1857. The members of this first among many authorities that we have must have had an exhilarated feeling of power, because Delhi would now not be just an oriental city, it was going to be treated like a world city. You notice the number of times one hears the term world class being used. I'm not totally sure what it means, but I'm sure somebody understands. But there is some element of wistful thinking in this. Planning was understood as a skill that had to be learnt from the USA and Britain. It also introduced a new language to the city. This is what I was referring to. This language is officialese. How many of us read the boxed items which appear on unlikely pages, like the sports page of newspapers, about the change, inverted commas, change of land use of a park into a car park? It sounds fairly innocuous, but in an area which is indicated in language that defeats even Google Maps. Planning terms have been translated into tortuous Hindi, but does not exactly make for riveting reading. There's no evidence of serious observation or newest empathy with the way that cities had been built. The people who would be most affected always faced a curtain of incomprehension. Those at the other end of the spectrum, of course, were secure for other reasons. Jagmohan's plan to rebuild Shahjahanabad simplified the urban landscape in a manner which was possible only in a Lego design. Sections of it were carried through. If you've noticed the area in front of the Jama Masjid, reducing the area between the Jama Masjid and the fort to a strange kind of untidiness. The most spectacular faux pas was that the master plan defined the whole of Shahjahanabad as a slum in the master plan. This term originated in the USA and was based on population density. The Indian census officials in 1951 would have been hard put to tabulate tables of residents. It was a very difficult time because thousands had left the city, many more than had left in 1857. A larger number had streamed in, so it was not possible to disentangle ownership and occupation and so on. The Bharat Sevak Samaj published a booklet listing the katras in the city. And they entitled it, because Katra probably wouldn't make sense to people, they called it the slums of Shahjahanabad. I tried to tally them against older records and realized that what was being called Katras were the hastily abandoned Havelis, which had been occupied by immigrants from what had become Pakistan. Living with one room to a family, continuing this as late as the 1980s, when I happened to go there with members from the slum department. The people were not, didn't look slum-like in any way, but they were prepared to occupy a very small space. And many of the spacious Havelis that Pavan Verma set out to discover in 1987 had by then morphed into crowded but secure communities of people who were putting away their hard-earned money and investing them on flats in Rajendra Nagar. There must be some term in economics for this kind of, how money is spent and so on, but somebody else can tell me that. Here was an opportunity for the DDA. They could have prepared a detailed map of the buildings and occupation pattern, as was done for Warsaw and other ravaged cities in Europe after the Second World War. But the DDA, by casually designating not individual mohallas but the whole city as a slum, in a single sentence, discarded an imperial city in the rubbish heap of shacks, the home of the homeless. An impartial eye could see a different pattern. Some years ago, there were two young Italian students of architecture, Marco and Elisa, who pictured Shahjahanabad, I thought that really charming, as a pomegranate. The gullies were the veins, and the mohallas were the glowing seeds. It was a pleasing image, which could be a template for conservative surgery, which is Patrick Geddes' term for how to deal with an old city. 2 decades later, a shock wave hit the city in the darkness of the emergency months. The area near Turkman Gate was overcrowded, and when the Delhi Improvement Trust had surveyed the area in the 1930s, it had been suggested that people be persuaded to move beyond the gate, just adjacent to it. The unfinished task of the DIT was carried through in 1976 by its new avatar, when Jagmohan, Sanjay Gandhi, and the DDA supervised the demolition of the dilapidated houses. For the truckloads of people who were ferried across the Yamuna, there was only a sense of overwhelming loss. They had been wrenched away from the comfort of proximity to the city center, to the desert of a deadening silence. So had their ancestors been banished to Nizamuddin, to the Kutab, and to Patparganj after the mutiny after the rising of 1857. Every experience has a shadow of a memory. There are other memories of destruction. The older in time, the more the likelihood of these being made to sound more horrific than they actually were. Nearer our time, there is the reality of the destruction of the Akbarabadi Masjid in 1858 by the British Army to have a clear shooting range around the fort. The name became a reality to me when I used a magnifying glass to look at Felice Beato's photographs taken in February 1858. And the clear image of that splendid building stood out for the first and last time, because after that it was destroyed. Another massive structure, the Sarai of Jahanhara and Chandni Chowk, was demolished to make room for the town hall, the future of which lies in the balance today. We should give serious thought to this. What do we want there? A five-star hotel to look out over the city, or as at the moment we can do from the Minar of the Jama Masjid, or a conjectured sarai fronted by the moonlight pool. A renovated town hall with a city museum, a library, music rooms, children's activity room. These are what one can fantasize. Other cities have city museums. People of substance have been talking about creating one since the 1970s, and we have ended up with a partition museum. Can't we have a museum that wakens light, laughter, and poetry? Can we give time to thinking of how to revive the city? It will involve rebuilding, but it should be done with the people, not for them or against them. Another demoralizing term, a stereotype rather than an accurate one, used by planners is the walled city. For the record, Shahjahanabad was effectively a walled city only from 1807 to 58. The East India Company found the mud walls ineffective, and Colonel Smith built a strong one with French-style bastions. And in September 1857, the poor British stuck on the northern bridge had a hard time breaking down their own wall to get back into the city. To the Town Planning Committee of 1912, Shahjahanabad was the old city, as distinct from the imperial city. The term walled city became current after independence and should not be seen so much as an administrative category as a mental one. The walls are in the eyes of the observer. The writer William Golding was visiting Delhi. He stopped to gaze at the Red Fort walls. Perhaps he imagined the parallel between an extravagant Shah Jahan and the ambition of the deacon of the cathedral, whom he described in his powerful novel, The Spire. He focused his camera. Look, he said, at the absolute power it exudes. A high wall, a wide space to shut off the ruler from his subjects. But that's because he did not know that the Mughal city had actually gone right up to the fort, and it was the British Army after 1857 that had cleared an arc of neighborhoods, along with the Akbarabadi Masjid, to create the barrier, which they nicknamed Champ de Mars, which is an illusion probably lost on most people, a reference to the Paris massacre of 1791. The power of language. The poetry of the Delhi poets, or the stern rules of the DDA, of the ASI, and the ministries, all shape the way we read Shahjahanabad. There are other sources of information, maps, old records, letters, which will become evident when we listen to the speakers over the next few days. The sheer difficulty of locating these archives and the wearing conditions of taking notes led many of us, to let the material shape our work rather than selecting the material to strengthen our arguments. I remember wasting many days copying material I never used from the old India Office Library for the sole reason that the Punjab records were not available in India, only in Lahore and in London. When we get access to files which we've been waiting for decades, we forget our dust allergies and plunge into them. What was classified as the Mutiny Papers in 1925, when Edward Thompson wrote The Other Side of the Medal, a revision of the accepted version of the 1857 Rising, was to be used to good effect a century later by William Dalrymple and Mahmood Farooqi. I would like to recall somebody called Mohanlal Kachru. When he joined the Chief Commissioner's office as a junior employee, he saw a glorious bonfire blazing. He was told they were the old records for which nobody had any use. He had the fire put out, took what was left and put them into some order. This was the beginning of the Delhi State Archives. So we worked with whatever had been saved. I don't know what went. Donald Ferrell, Robert Irving, and I were there at the beginning, using what had been rescued. And now the Delhi State Archives is a large building, most of its papers digitized, and a culture of helpfulness which has drawn many young students to work there. A fire is a convenient gambit. At the town hall, home of the MCD, when I asked about records, they said it had all been destroyed in a fire. I was looking around and shifted a dusty curtain and found them all stacked up there. I have to balance this account by referring to an actual fire which did happen in Jamnagar House, which destroyed the extremely well-maintained files of the Rehabilitation Ministry after 1947. Another roadblock was what I call the cartophobia of the officials. Cartophobia meaning fear of maps. We were allowed to look at some maps, but never to copy them or come back again. One decision beyond my time, which was taken by one person, ended all that. Mushirul Hassan was director of the National Archives for a short period. He allowed unrestricted access to all maps. And one enthusiastic researcher, Pilar Guerrieri, an Italian woman, put together a large format atlas of Delhi, and all of us are beholden to her for this. Earlier, Susan Golay had gone on a painstaking research for her indigenous maps, for India, and her book has some Shahjahanabad maps, including 2 detailed ones of the main streets. One detailed map showing buildings and thanas in 1850s in the India Office Library was locked away as too fragile, but it has been reproduced recently, and Dr. Swapna Little, who will be speaking tomorrow, has done full justice to its potential by publishing it as a book. On the subject of maps, drawings, and photographs, so many scholars are beholden to a person who passed away last year, Jerry Losty of the India Office Library, whose helpfulness led to many wonderful pieces of research. Working on towns gives access to special archives, the open-air one. One could say quite guiltlessly that one was going for a walk through one's thesis. There is something unique in a city which has shaped its mohalla or quartiers, Chippiwada in Shahjahanabad or Saint-Germain, Paris, with curving gullies cooled by a breeze even in the torrid days of June, roofs which children could run across, and the Havelis of the rich and famous, as miniature killers, as Stephen Blake described them, all in very mixed neighborhoods, not segregated. Archives are for scholars, reports are for planners. It is possible that planners could be more realistic if they factored in archives as well as the living city. Peter Geddes wrote about slums in Edinburgh after he lived there for some time to experience things at first hand. Edgar Ribeiro, who's in the DDA, spent his lunch hour strolling through the lanes around Vikas Minar, enjoying the simple snacks on offer in illegal shacks. Even a fine planner like Syed Shafi, whose second S was said to stand for Shahjahanabad, and who lived in the shadow of the Jama Masjid, got taken by the sales pitch of the Ford Foundation experts. And only much later did he realize how, instead of the drastic changes made, much of the Indian city could have been retained and enhanced. We cannot fault anyone for lack of institutional controls. The Delhi Urban Art Commission was created in 1974 just for that, to ensure that urban additions were aesthetic and humane. But urban art, you'll notice, is usually spelled with an S, urban arts. So nobody's quite clear what it's talking about. And was understood to refer to presentations of culture. It has, unfortunately, degenerated into a sanctioning authority when it could have initiated so much. When architects and conservation experts came into the discussion, they brought with them a bunch of optimistic terms: rejuvenation, redevelopment, revitalization, which is surely not at issue so much as drains and electricity were. I'm sure they were included, but somehow it got lost in the more generalized phrases. City-wide and time-bound schemes need to be constantly kept in mind. A regular scheme should go beyond cosmetic changes aimed at tourists and work with and for the inhabitants. I'm coming to an end now. And above all, green areas, sensitive lighting should all be given a lot of attention in consonance with what the local people want. We need community action, not just evidence of government departments. I do not know of any city which is synonymous with a language. Who am I to speak of the language that grew in Shahjahanabad in the course of centuries, of the stimulating rivalry of Lucknow and Hyderabad, an inclusive language, united all classes, that cut across cults, was nourishment and a sense of well-being, the music of the public spheres, the solace of the illiterate, something that united Iran and India centuries ago, Indo-Aryan languages, I beg your pardon, had done. This seminar promises riches for the audience. Retrieve Urdu. This is the Taraqi we all need badly. Come back to Shahjahanabad, give back to Shahjahanabad its self-respect, and perhaps some of you can add Dehlavi to your names. When I first met Shahjahanabad, it was a venerable city and I was young. Today I'm old, Shahjahanabad remains young. Young is defined by optimism and hope, and the evidence of optimism in this celebration is at a time when plenty is happening in the world for us to grieve about is wonderful. Maheshwar Dayal was correct when he said to me, rather tolerantly years and years ago, "Aap kaise likhenge Dilli ke baare mein? Aap to Dilli ke nahi ho." So that is true. But if we all took that seriously, no one would write about Delhi. None of us claims to know the city fully, which is what makes it a city. I'll end with the words written about Paris by the brilliant architectural historian Norma Evanson. Has Paris ceased to be Paris? Certainly the city has changed and will continue to do so. Paris today is a populous, urbanized region in which the historic center forms a specialized and symbolically crucial part. The traditional image of Paris, these are all applicable here, is vital to its attraction. Yet the greatness of the city has never depended on a single specific ensemble of buildings or configuration of streets. It is the very vitality of the city which continually threatens the stability of the physical environment. Contrary to rumor, Paris is alive and well and living in Paris. And so is Shahjahanabad.